Hello and welcome to Edie Extra. We're coming to you live from the Collaboration Hub at the Edie 26 conference in central London. So this is the place to be for you to learn about navigating some of the hottest topics and toughest challenges in sustainable business right now. So we're bringing our long-standing podcast series to life here at the Business Design Centre, recording short and snappy panel discussions that look to the horizon to discuss the next big trends facing corporate climate action. So we're recording today's discussion, and the audio podcast will shortly be live on edie.net, as well as on all of our streaming and podcast channels. So for today, let me introduce you to our panellists. First off, I'm Matilda Cox. I'm Edie's interim content editor, and I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel Keir, who's a climate resilience specialist at Zurich Resilience Solutions, and Sean Grundy, who is the head of strategic innovation at ZRS. So for this discussion, we're going to be talking about safeguarding the UK's clean energy strategy. So as the country accelerates towards a future that's more powered by green energy, intensifying climate impacts, whether that's extreme weather or infrastructure disruption, are already testing the resilience of the systems that we depend on. So with that in mind, I'd like to bring in our panel to explore what climate resilience really means for the UK's clean energy transition and where the biggest risks but also the biggest opportunities lie as we move from strategy to delivery. So thanks very much to both of you for joining the discussion. So Dan, I'll come to you first. Just as kind of a bit of an overview, why is it important that risk and resilience are considered as the UK moves ahead with its clean energy goals?
Sure. Well, firstly, it's great to be here on the podcast. I'm really happy to share our insight and expertise on climate risk resilience and energy security. I mean, risk and resilience for the energy system is absolutely critical. I'd probably take a step back and look at it holistically. And, climate disruption is happening now. It's not a theoretical scenario in the future in 2050 or beyond. We're seeing impacts now. We have been seeing impacts for years, and they're getting increasingly more frequent and more severe, whether it's extreme heat impacting productivity, storms, floods, like devastating infrastructure and assets. I mean, we all know the core impacts and we know that they're getting worse, but ultimately there's not enough attention, action or investment happening on adaptation or resilience, and especially when you consider that we're not hitting our net zero targets or our climate targets, it makes it even more pertinent. And so then linking that back to energy, I'd probably lean to three of the main drivers as to why renewable energy deployment is increasing so rapidly and why we need it to increase, as to why risk and resilience is so important. So firstly, there's energy security. We rely too heavily on imports or fossil fuel imports. So we need to develop more of our own renewable energy source in the UK to sort of build that energy security. Secondly, the economy. It just makes financially more sense now to invest in solar, wind, other renewable energy assets. And then from a climate perspective, in order to meet our net zero goals, we've got the UK Clean Power Mission as well. We need to increase our deployment of renewable energies. Those three things, to me, make it really clear why it's so important to understand our risks and invest in resilience, because if we don't, it's going to threaten our energy security, it's going to have massive impacts on our economy, and then from a climate perspective, it's going to make it really difficult to meet our net zero goals and our climate targets. So from those three perspectives, it's absolutely critical, understanding risk and implementing resilience system-wide.
Yeah. And that energy security piece is obviously particularly pertinent right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So to kind of hone in specifically on risks, for listeners that might not be aware of what risk looks like in this context, what asset types across low carbon tech are particularly exposed to risk and how?
I think this is a good chance to introduce a research or piece of study that Zurich Resilience Solutions carried out last year. We released a report called Safeguarding Our Energy Future, so similar name to this podcast. I'll circle back to that shortly. First, just to contextualise risk. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about the combination of hazard, exposure and vulnerability. And when any of those components increase, the overall risk is increasing. And so linking that to energy, we know exposure is increasing. There's mass deployment of renewable energy at the moment. Our research study piece from last year showed that renewable energy makes up around 49% of the overall energy capacity generation in Europe, and that's forecast to increase to 67% by 2030. So yeah, there's mass deployment there of renewable energies. We know the hazards increasing, we know storms are getting more intense, rainfall's getting more intense, flood depths are increasing, extreme heat's becoming more of an issue, wildfires. We know the hazards increasing, and from a vulnerability perspective as well, that looks at how vulnerable or how different climate perils will impact different technology types. So for example, for solar, we know that wind gusts, hail, floods are going to be particularly sort of impactful on solar. Maybe vulnerability is not increasing, but definitely hazards and exposure is increasing. And so that can link me back to the research study that we did last year, where we modelled tens of thousands of energy generation and storage assets throughout Europe. We modelled them against with our climate data. We layered on top a vulnerability impact analysis, so different generation technology types have different vulnerabilities to different hazards, and we combined those to create a risk categorization of each energy asset in Europe. So risk categorization from 1 to 5, with those top 2 categories being labelled as critical risk categories. And our research showed that by 2030, 46% of all renewable generation capacity will be in those top 2 categories, so those critical risk categories, which is quite an alarming number, that almost half of our energy or electricity generation in renewables is going to be in critical risk. And then within that renewable set, it's solar that is most at risk. With all that generation capacity in those critical risk categories, 58% of that generation is coming from solar, and then hydro and onshore wind are next, with around 21%. So in summary, it's solar that's going to be most at risk to climate hazards and climate risk moving forward into the future. And we've got our Safeguarding Our Energy Future report. So if you search ZRS Safeguarding Energy Future, and you'll be able to find that report with those insights and more, because it's a really extensive piece of research that we did.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, if I can, what that risk looks like is actually that solar farm or that wind farm being unavailable for a period of time. So we're looking at clean energy. We've got a 2030 goal, we've got a 2035 goal with ESO, and we're actually saying to ourselves we want to deploy these technologies to rely on in the future. And the challenge we have is the changing climate and the changing shape of the impact of the climate means that places these assets at risk. So if we want to rely on 50% of our generation coming from clean tech, we've got to protect that clean tech, right? So ultimately, the risk is, well, that generation isn't going to be there for us to use in our homes. So we may have backup generation, which is hydrocarbon based, or we may not. Does it mean that climate change impacts on those technologies will force power cuts, reduced power availability, which is something we've not experienced in the UK for generations? And so that's what we ought to be thinking about. What does risk look like? Well, ultimately, it could look like that.
And Sean, coming back to you, so we've talked a lot about the risks, but what's the opportunity here? Is it purely financial, or is there kind of more to be gained?
It's interesting how we all focus on the economics of the risk, right? But let us not forget that actually it's going to cost us money to build in resilience. So there's a bit of a balance there between the cost of achieving a good risk position. I mean, ultimately, what that investment is doing is protecting future revenue streams, right? So that's the big ask. But of course, if you look at it from a hierarchical point of view, society is finely balanced. The way that we generate power, transmit power, consume power, it's all very finely balanced. And so the opportunity here is to maintain that balance, which means we all carry on living our lives as we like to. We all switch on the lights and use our devices at home, and we're now charging cars more often than not. And so the opportunity is to maintain the balance of our lifestyle. So society continues with its business as usual. I think that's something we can't lose sight on. What we're trying to do is to ensure that for the future generations, our life continues. Our life changes in terms of our habits and what we like to use from a technology perspective. We want to maintain the reliability of that, the sustainability of that. So that's the big opportunity. And of course, we can't forget that quite often environmental impacts, especially the significant large disasters that we have seen in some parts of the world, actually result in fatalities. And we ought to be saying to ourselves, well, our investment can prevent that, and our assessment of risk can prevent that. So we have to think about us as human beings and how susceptible we are to the damage that climate change can cause, the society that we're building and want to sustain, and then of course that revenue stream that we want to try and protect. So there are layers and layers of opportunities that if we don't get that investment right now, we will be paying for it in the future in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've spoken about the big picture stuff, but obviously it's the individual businesses that are going to have to kind of implement this. So what can organisations do to change their internal cultures to account for the risk and then the investments that are required? So Dan, maybe if I come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I'd say to that about helping develop that internal culture for resilience. One of them being shifting the sort of narrative of resilience to one of a core business function and strategy rather than just a specialist topic on the side. It really needs to be embedded in everyday strategic decisions, performance metrics, in investment decisions. And it's using that resilience narrative because, risk is obviously very important, but actually the opportunity comes from resilience is what we were talking about. If you message it around an opportunity to build resilience, then that adds a commercial mindset to it, and there's then much more opportunity for action.
So when we look at cultures, right, cultures are built from behaviours, and we don't drive a new culture unless we think about our behaviours. Behaviours and culture are informed by knowledge, right? So the very first step, in our opinion, is that organisations and those that are leading the decision making need to bring the knowledge into their organisations. That knowledge is about the impact, the reality, the realness of climate change and the impact. And until we start to bring the knowledge in and consume the knowledge in a way that allows us to say we are at threat, whether it's one location or all of the corporation and the supply chain, we need to be saying to ourselves, right, okay, there is enough information out there for us to act on. And that knowledge should start, if you like, an internal cultural revolution in those organisations that aren't already on the path to change. We're well aware that there are some very large organisations that are changing, have got some good cultures, got some good practices. But what we need to see is those that are behind start to listen, start to bring in that knowledge, open the window, if you like, and let the knowledge in, and let that knowledge drive new decisions and new actions. I think that's the very first start of that cultural development. The changes that are required with management systems, processes, investment decisions will all come from that. But we need that start.
Yeah. And in terms of changing the internal culture, one thing that a lot of companies are kind of battling with is this long-term versus short-term mindset. So even though climate risk is a massively long-term factor, they've got these kind of short-term mindsets that are limiting change. How could we flip this conversation to embed risk into decision-making that's happening now?
So if we all have the knowledge and we can all feel the pain, we will make decisions sooner. And so, again, it is linked to cultural development. We know ourselves there are some health conditions that we don't think about until it's too late, right? So I think in an organisation, we need to be able to look at what the evidence is telling us and be honest with ourselves and say, right, okay, I need to invest now in order to protect my future. And that's a very small, simple, it doesn't cost any money to start to use that knowledge inside an organisation. I think interestingly as well, when we think about the ESO connection process and the auction that's annually done for capacity, the ESO run, and actually if you think of two worlds where you've got one facility that's looking for a tariff through the auction that has invested in future-proofing through climate resilience and one that hasn't, the one that hasn't will be cheaper. Yeah. The one that hasn't will be cheaper, will fare more favourably in an auction. So we need to start to think about, in our industries and in our practices, how we can influence the level playing field so that everybody is investing in the future, which means that when somebody goes to the auction next year, they will be thinking about the short term as the long term.
Yeah, not penalising organisations for having embedded resilience and investing more and having to charge more.
Yep.
There needs to be a minimum, almost a mandated minimum level of resilience embedded into these projects.
Yep.
So as we said, those that have invested in the resilience aren't penalised by having to charge more or bid more.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for this ED Extra discussion. So thank you so much to both of our speakers for their time and sharing their insights, and also to Zurich Resilience Solutions for sponsoring the session. So thank you to everyone in the audience for your time and attention. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.